Welcome to the Clearground Show. I'm your host, Dr. G, with a PhD. So today I'm going to answer a question in the mailbag, which is pretty interesting and something I've been reading a little bit about these last few days. Then we're going to talk about COVID, lots of COVID updates. We're going to look at a new commercial, which I think is going to surprise all of you if you haven't already seen it. We'll take a look at the new Danish recommendations for COVID-19 vaccination. We'll do a bit of a dive into schools and what happened in the U.S. to education during COVID, especially in grades 1 through 3. And we'll compare that to Sweden, and they took totally opposite approaches, and we'll see who came out better. President Biden says the pandemic is over, but we'll see if his handlers let him get away with that. All that and much, much more in today's episode. We'll start today's episode off by answering a question from the comment section. This question was submitted by Hunter. I had always thought that nuclear had one of the highest levelized costs of energy for any source. By what metric were you considering when you said it was cheap? Thank you for the question, and I'll try my best to answer it in a short time frame. It's actually a quite in-depth question. So for starters, here's a quick paragraph from the World Nuclear Association that lays out the levelized cost per unit of output across a bunch of energy producing technologies. I'm going to read it out loud just in case people are listening. So the paragraph reads, in 2017, the US EIA published figures for the average levelized cost per unit of output for generating technologies to be brought online in 2022, as modeled for its annual energy outlook. These show advanced nuclear at 9.9 cents per kilowatt hour, natural gas between 5.7 and 10.9 cents per kilowatt hour, depending on the technology, coal with 90% carbon sequestration, 12.3 cents per kilowatt hour, and that rises to 14 cents per kilowatt hour at 30% carbon sequestration. And then among the non-dispatchable technologies, the levelized cost per unit of output estimates pretty widely, with wind onshore at 5.2 cents per kilowatt hour, solar photovoltaic cells at 6.7 cents per kilowatt hour, offshore wind at 14.6 cents per kilowatt hour, and solar thermal at 18.4 cents per kilowatt hour. Now that paragraph alone is kind of interesting, but what's really interesting is how we got there. Again, a brief asterisk, this is just going to scratch the surface. I'm going to put a bunch of links to nuclear information and energy information in the description. I highly encourage everyone that's interested to go read this stuff. It's pretty intricate and pretty in-depth, but extremely interesting. So first off, what is the levelized cost of electricity? Like, what's the definition? And it's basically the total cost to build and operate a power plant over its lifetime divided by the total electricity output dispatched from the plant all over that period. So this is why you'll typically see it as cost per megawatt hour or some version of that. Now the dominant component of lifetime costs for nuclear power plants and nuclear power in general is what's called the overnight construction cost. This includes the cost of direct engineering, procurement, and construction services that the vendors and the architect engineer team are contracted to provide, as well as the indirect owner's costs, which include land, site preparation, project management, training, contingencies, commissioning costs, etc., etc., etc. So with that in mind, the first paper we're going to look at to discuss this comes from Energy Policy, which is under the Elsevier domain, and the title of that article is Historical Construction Costs of Global Nuclear Power Reactors. For sake of time, we're just going to focus on the US, but the trends across a bunch of other countries are very different than the US, and it's important to note. So this paper shows construction duration of nuclear power plants in years by overnight construction costs in 2010 dollars. What you'll see here is they divide the plants into two categories, those that were completed before the 3 Mile Island accident and those that were in construction during the 3 Mile Island accident. Now, a caveat to this chart that you guys may not know is the last reactor to come online in the US began construction in 1978. 3 Mile Island occurred in 1979. Overnight construction costs were rising between 1970 and 1978 before the 3 Mile Island accident, but after the 3 Mile Island accident, they really spiked. So between 1970 and 1978, there was an annual increase between 5 and 15% of the overnight construction costs for nuclear power plants. Ultimately, however, the paper found that other duration-related issues such as licensing, regulatory delays, and backfit requirements are a significant contributor to the rising overnight construction cost trend. So taking a look at the regulatory burden on nuclear power plants, The American Action Forum found the average nuclear plant bears an annual regulatory burden of around $60 million, with 22 of those million going in fees to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and 32.7 of those million going to regulatory liabilities. So in order to update existing plants alone, you need the NRC's approval. You also need the NRC's approval if you want to start a new plant. For currently existing plants, it has taken the NRC an average of 80 months to approve the most recent combined construction and operation licenses. In theory, it's very good to have safety standards, and that's not the issue at hand with the NRC. The issue at hand with the NRC specifically is that they do not provide early feedback that lets companies properly assess regulatory risk before investing hundreds of millions of dollars in further design and development. And just in terms of safety, here's a brief table that compares the NRC base requirement of safety that you need for every nuclear reactor just to operate. And then it shows the current plants and their operation and how much safer they are than the NRC's requirement. And then it shows all the other types of plants that we are looking at building in the future or could build in the future and how much safer they are than the current NRC requirements. And you'll see that they're a lot safer. And again, all this risk goes into the cost. There's a reason why we haven't started construction on a new nuclear power plant in a long time in the US. What makes a lot of the suppression of nuclear so interesting to me personally is how much fuel 1 kilogram of uranium actually produces. The European Nuclear Society has a great little section on this, and now I'm going to read from a paragraph in that section, and it says the following. With a complete combustion or fission, approximately 8 kilowatt hours of heat can be generated from 1 kilogram of coal, approximately 12 kilowatt hours of energy from 1 kilogram of mineral oil, and around 24 million kilowatt hours from 1 kilogram of uranium-235. So allowing for the fact that the uranium is fully enriched, this uranium-235 contains 2 to 3 million times the energy equivalent of oil or coal. So not only is uranium a total energy powerhouse, it's also pretty abundant. It's more abundant in the Earth's crust than gold, silver, or mercury. Now, by the end of 2021, the U.S. had 93 operating commercial nuclear reactors at 55 nuclear power plants in 28 states. The average age of the nuclear reactors is about 40 years old. Here's a chart showing the U.S. net electricity generation by source, and it's in terawatt hours, and you can see it's from 2010 to 2019, and you can see nuclear has been totally consistent, barely fluctuating at 809 terawatt hours. So we haven't even talked about the fact that nuclear is quote unquote green, right? It doesn't release CO2 into the atmosphere. Besides that factor, just the raw potential for uranium is insane. And it's such a powerful source that we can control and use as energy. And the technology has come a long way since the 50s. It's significantly safer, as you saw in that other chart, for the NRC. So you would imagine with all these things combined that the federal government might subsidize nuclear as much as possible. Well, unfortunately, you'd be wrong, and this is another piece of the puzzle as to the cost of nuclear energy being what it is. Looking at this net electricity generation by source chart again, towards the bottom you see wind and solar. This makes sense because these energy sources aren't, they're dependent on a lot of factors that make them less reliable, so they can only turn them on in certain situations. So here's what doesn't make sense, and this is a chart from, again, 2010 to 2019, and this shows federal subsidies per unit of electricity generated. Solar has about 42.7 times the amount of federal subsidies than nuclear, and wind has about 9.8 times the federal subsidies than nuclear. So nuclear takes up significantly less land mass than either wind or solar. It produces significantly more energy than wind or solar, and it's constant, reliable energy versus dependent on various climate activities, and yet is only subsidized at a fraction of the amount as these other energy sources. So again, just looking at the sources of energy, nuclear is kind of middle of the pack, but it has the potential to be significantly cheaper. And not only does it have the potential to be significantly cheaper, it's the only alternative energy source to oil and gas that is reliable and scalable. I want to thank Hunter again for the question, and it let us dive down a little bit into this rabbit hole of nuclear energy. I hope maybe it might have explained part of what I meant by cheap. It's just a kind of a complicated question with lots of factors going into it. I hope this also inspired everybody to go read up a little more nuclear. It's a really interesting topic, and I think it would behoove the world to have as many people know as much about it as possible. Now we're going to change gears and talk about some COVID news. First, we'll start with this commercial.
I've been into fashion since I can remember. But one day I had a stomach ache so bad I didn't want to do anything. The team at New York Presbyterian said it was actually my heart. It was severely swollen. Something called myocarditis. But doctors gave me medicines and used machines to control my heartbeat. They saved me. So now I can become the next great fashion designer.
Now, that was aired by the New York Presbyterian Hospital in early September. So I've seen billboards and ads pop up here and there, especially when driving in the city on myocarditis, but it's been pretty rare. This is the first commercial I see targeted specifically at children with myocarditis. Now, we've discussed vaccine-induced myocarditis in a number of capacities, from the VAERS episode all the way until recently the Thailand study discussing myocarditis in children from the vaccine. This brings up a lot of questions. One, how prevalent is it? I mean, if we're starting to get commercials about this stuff for kids, it leads me to believe that it's much more prevalent than is being even reported right now. Number two, I think that we shouldn't normalize this. Hospitals shouldn't be airing commercials saying that, oh, hey, it's okay to get myocarditis, we'll help you. No, instead, we can prevent this. We've shown this time and time again on this show, but I'm going to do it again with the latest stats. And children ages 0 to 17 are not the ones dying from COVID, not even close. That's not to say no kids have died from COVID, but the number is very, very, very small, way smaller than flu. I mean, if you look at flu 2019 to 2020, look at that season, and you can, it breaks it down by age here in this category, and you can see that, you know, the incident fatality rate of flu in kids 0 to 4 is about 1.8. In people 18 to 49, it's 1.6. You look at COVID, it's way less than 1. It's less than 0.1, as a matter of fact. As it has been since the very beginning, this is largely a disease impacting the elderly, and the data remain the same. The data shows the exact same thing right now as it did 12 months ago. So instead of normalizing myocarditis in children, hospitals should normalize risk assessment in parents and say, hey, here's the data, here are the stats. Kids really don't need this vaccination. There's a lot of vaccination that helps kids, and this one is not one of those by all available data. Speaking of updated COVID vaccine policy, the Danish Health Authority is expecting that the number of COVID-19 infections are going to increase during the autumn and winter. And no surprise there, that's a decent guess. But they're changing the recommendation to vaccination in recommending it for those ages 50 and over. They do make a caveat for those that are at a high risk and are younger than 50, but that's the only caveat they make. Reading now from their website on Q&A about vaccination in the coming fall. Who will be offered vaccination against COVID-19? People aged 50 years and over will be offered vaccination. People aged under 50 who are at higher risk of becoming severely ill from COVID-19 will also be offered vaccination against COVID-19. Ostensibly, one reason for this may be that the risk-reward calculation changes above the age of 50 versus below the age of 50 for this vaccine. So besides vaccination, the policy that was undertaken during the COVID-19 pandemic for kids in schools had a really bad impact in America. Reading now from the New York Times, the pandemic erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. Now, before briefly looking into the article, I would change this heading to pandemic policies erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. As we'll see after the New York Times, Sweden did something totally different, and the results were, you might guess, totally different. So, quoting from the New York Times, this year, for the first time since the National Assessment of Educational Progress tests began tracking student achievement in the 1970s, 9-year-olds lost ground in math, and scores in reading fell by the largest margin in more than 30 years. The declines spanned almost all races and income levels and were markedly worse for the lowest performing students. While top performers in the 90th percentile showed a modest drop, 3 points in math, students in the bottom 10th percentile dropped by 12 points in math, which is 4 times the impact. Well, that's impressive for me to see. The New York Times can still do math. Very good. Dr. Ho, who is a professor in education in Harvard, says that, or he estimates that losing 1 point on the national exam roughly translates to about 3 weeks of learning. So that means a top performing student who lost 3 points in math could catch up in about 9 weeks, while a low performing student who lost 12 points would need 36 weeks or almost 9 months to make up ground and would still significantly be behind more advanced peers. And this all makes sense. When you take kids and pull them out of a physical environment and try to put them virtual, of course, all kinds of things are going to plummet, especially when it comes to learning and paying attention. It's just not going to happen, and this was a totally predictable outcome. As a matter of fact, I and a bunch of others were saying this exact thing would happen. Now, to further bolster the claim that it wasn't, an accident, or this wasn't some offshoot that, maybe America's weird, maybe it was something besides these pandemic policies that caused kids learning to go so south. Well, we actually have a comparison. We can take a look at Sweden. This article was published June 2nd of 2022, and the title is No Learning Loss in Sweden During the Pandemic, Evidence from Primary School Reading Assessments. Now, this is important because this is the same age group that the New York Times was talking about. So it's a directly comparable age group. This study took data from 97,073 Swedish primary school students. That's, again, grades 1 through 3. And the results showed that word decoding and reading comprehension scores were not lower during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. The final conclusion was that open schools benefited Swedish primary school students. Now, the link is in the description, so anybody that wants to go read can and should read as per usual. I'm just going to show you one of the graphs, and keep in mind all the graphs in this study look the exact same basically. And what they'll show is the test period at the bottom, so fall, winter, spring, and the reading comprehension scores on the y-axis. And you'll see they're the same. You can't tell the difference between any given year from 2017 to 2018 to 2020, 2021. It looks the exact same. This is really great news for Sweden, and America should take some notes. It can be kind of hard to granularly quantify exactly what part of school kids learn the best, and it's really hard to be super specific about it. But in the broad scope, this study shows what we all know, that it is very important for kids, especially at these young ages, to be physically with their peers, to be discussing with their peers, to be with their teachers in person, reading the books, physical books, playing in the playground. These are all really important things to development. And, this study hopefully elucidates that, and I hope that we don't make this mistake again. This isn't to say that this action isn't warranted in some cases or in some diseases. It is to say that we should be much more evidence-based and look at the data honestly before enforcing such a destructive policy. In other news, at least the pandemic is over, according to Biden.
Mr. President, first Detroit auto show in 3 years.
Yeah.
Is the pandemic over?
The pandemic is over. We still have a problem with COVID. We're still doing a lot of work on it. But the pandemic is over. If you notice, no one's wearing masks. Everybody seems to be in pretty good shape. And so I think it's changing, and I think this is a perfect example of it.
You heard it straight from the horse's mouth. Well, I'm glad to hear him say that. Unfortunately, that's actually not what his White House is doing. Uh-oh. Oh well. Just when we thought this was the real one, I guess it wasn't. And here the Washington Post comes out and just says the quiet part out loud. In an article titled, No, President Biden, the pandemic is not over. The Washington Post makes the claim that Mr. Biden has not ended the official pandemic emergency. When the official emergency ends, some 15 million will lose Medicaid coverage. The reason for a student loan repayment pause will end. The rationale for Trump-era border restrictions still held in place by a court will disappear. All this policy transition must not be done carelessly or hastily. Oh, so you mean there's reasons outside of the disease spread, which is traditionally the definition of the pandemic, that are dictating what the pandemic is. Okay. Well, that's good to know that all these policies now dictate the pandemic. So I wonder when it is we'll actually be out of this thing. Who knows? One country that's surprisingly backing out of their COVID restrictions is New Zealand. Let's take a look at what they're doing.
The government is facing backlash over its decision to drop vaccine mandates and its COVID protection framework.
Nurses and public health experts are feeling blindsided by the move, and as Alexa Cook reports, even some members of the public aren't ready for it.
Masks may no longer be mandatory on public transport, but passengers are still opting to cover up.
Makes you feel a lot safer, especially on public transport.
I'm keeping mine on for a wee bit, yep.
Ditching masks on public transport and in supermarkets has left some feeling nervous.
I was a little hesitant, I would have to say.
It'd be a really good idea to keep on with them, particularly for people like me who are immunocompromised.
Some bus drivers agree.
The bus drivers will feel more protected if...
So they're dropping all their mandates. So what does the Prime Minister have to say about all this?
People will use masks for their own individual reasons. They may personally be vulnerable. They may have events they want to make sure they're not unwell for. They may not have had COVID-19. We all just need to respect everyone's individual decisions.
Oh, so now we all need to respect everyone's individual health decisions. Wow, this is What science is this based on? I guess New Zealand must be really experiencing a lull in cases and deaths. Pretty interesting stuff, huh? Looks like both the cases and the deaths per million people in New Zealand are the highest they've been basically this entire pandemic. My unfortunate takeaway from all this is that the pandemic is over when these clowns say it is. And by the way, how many people do you think would turn around and say, oh, pandemic's back on, if tomorrow Joe Biden says, hey, pandemic's back on? Or if tomorrow the Prime Minister of New Zealand says, hey, pandemic's back on? How many people do you think would just flip-flop on the spot? I think, unfortunately, quite a few. That is, unfortunately, all the time we have today. On Friday, I've got a few more stories that I didn't get to today that I would like to cover, especially a monkeypox update. Surprise, surprise, there is no change. And I want to talk a little bit about the Canada euthanasia problem happening. It's pretty interesting. And with that, please have a great day, guys. I'll be back in a couple of days. I won't take a whole 10 days this time to get a new episode out. And comment any questions. I'd love to dive into it. Now, I can't promise I'll dive into every question like I did with Hunter's question this particular week, but please throw them in there and have conversations in the comments. It's all good stuff. Please enjoy this video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.
What's up? One shot from 6'7". Where you gonna head it at? Where? Right here. Where you throwing it? Where? Over the hoop. Oh, I want to see this. Hold up. Let me see. Let me see this.